If you are watching this video, chances are you want to learn how to sew, but every time you look at a sewing pattern, your brain explodes because you don't understand what anything means. There is nothing wrong with you. Sewing is an amazing hobby. It's super fun, but there's definitely a big learning curve at the beginning. And so in this video, we are just going to break down the very brass tacks basics of sewing. When you get that pattern, whether it's a PDF pattern or a print pattern, and you're looking at the pattern itself and you're looking at the booklet, like what all of this stuff means. Why do you need to know what a finished garment measurement is? What are all of these arrows? What are all of these lines? Why are these symbols here? I'm here to explain, hopefully make it a little bit easier. So if you buy a pattern or if you're thinking about sewing garments for the first time, it will just kind of demystify the entire thing for you. So before we even get started, there are a lot of different types of sewing patterns. The ones that we typically think of, I think, when we think of sewing patterns are ones that are created by the big four. So that's McCall, Simplicity, Butterick, and Vogue. Those companies have all been in business for over 100 years. And so you can go to a big box fabric store, you can find those patterns in the store. You can also find tons of vintage patterns on Etsy. And I know when I got started sewing, that was one of the things that excited me most, that I could finally make all the 70s clothes of my dreams, not out of polyester. So big four patterns, vintage versus new. But also, I would say in the last 20 years, the indie pattern world has completely exploded. I should know, I started one of the companies myself. Heather here from Closet Core Patterns. But there's literally hundreds of at this point, indie pattern companies. And to be honest, the quality ranges from exceptional to like pretty crappy. And my advice when you're getting started with a pattern is to try to start, especially those first projects, start with a pattern company that seems to have a decent following on Instagram, that seems to have a nice website. Maybe you can go online and find reviews for the patterns. Instagram is actually a great resource for this. People tend to be really share their honest experiences sewing a pattern, because there are a lot of kind of fly-by-night companies out there that offer either really cheap patterns or free patterns, and the quality tends to vary wildly. And I think sewing is one of those things where if you use a crappy pattern and you have a crappy experience, it tends to dissuade you from continuing and making more stuff. So, you know, invest in a good quality pattern, because not only is the drafting going to probably be good, they're going to have good instructions, and hopefully there's other additional resources to help you sew. Talking about modern sewing patterns, they tend to come in two formats. The first one is a print format like this. So you'll generally be able to find these at your local fabric store, or maybe you're buying them online from our website. And it will generally include an envelope, a booklet with all sorts of different instructions inside, and also your pattern tissue. This is kind of like the iconic sewing image to me, is this lightweight craft paper brown tissue. And this also has the sewing pattern printed on it. Of course, it's the future. We have the internet, we have all sorts of technology. So there is also a digital equivalent of this kind of analog pattern, and that is called a PDF sewing pattern. And almost every sewing pattern company out in the world these days has PDF sewing patterns. So what does that even mean? Like, how do you take a PDF that's digital and exists on your computer and then somehow get this out of it? Well, a few ways. So first one is a print at home format like this, where the pattern is actually printed on either like a letter or A4 format of paper. And this is the type of pattern that you can print at home on your printer, and then you can assemble it. We'll have another video for that. But this is really cool because it's like complete instant gratification. You could be like, I want to make a pair of pants, and print out a pair of pants and have the pattern ready to go like within an hour or two. Super exciting. Depending on the company, they might also include a copy shop format. So that's a bigger sheet size that you would take to a big printer, you know, the type of printer who's going to print like architectural plans. And you can have your pattern printed on these big sheets of paper, which means that you don't need to assemble those. So that's like a little bit of an easier option. And depending on the pattern company, you can also get projector files, which are super cool technology. You basically get a traditional projector like you'd use to watch TV or a movie, and you can project the pattern onto your fabric, and then that way you don't need any paper whatsoever, which is pretty cool, and like, welcome to the future. I love it. Those PDF patterns will also include an instruction booklet. You can probably just take a look at those on your phone or your tablet, but if you want, you can also print them out. So this is an example. You know, here's the PDF version of the print version that you can also buy. So it's kind of up to you what format you want and what format is available in the pattern that you're looking to sew. Okay, so now we understand all these different components that go into a sewing pattern. But what is actually a sewing pattern? The way that I try to explain it to people who don't understand sewing and don't understand what I do for a living is that it's basically like a blueprint for clothing. So if you look at any piece of clothing in your wardrobe, you're gonna see that there's all these different parts, right? You've got your front, your back, your sleeve, there's different cuffs. So all of those little pieces need to be cut individually out of fabric. And most patterns come in multiple sizes. So sometimes it can be a little bit confusing looking at a pattern because you're gonna see multiple lines layered over each other. Each one of these individual nested lines represents a different size. And so it's really important that you take your measurements to understand what size you need. Guess what? We have a video for that. And once you understand what size you need, you're gonna wanna identify what line type reflects the size that you need to cut out. I find it really helpful, especially when you're getting going for the first time, to highlight the size that you need to cut out with an actual highlighter, and then that way you don't get confused. One nice thing about PDF patterns, by the way, is that a lot of the times those sizes are layered, which means if you open it in something like Adobe Reader, you can turn off and on the sizes that you need to print. And I find this a much easier solution if you don't want to get confused by a bunch of sizes that you don't need. So now that we understand what all of those big, thick dashed lines are, let's talk about notches. Notches are probably one of the most important components of a sewing pattern. They help tell you where you need to match up pattern pieces. So when you have a sleeve, for example, and it needs to get inserted into the garment, you're gonna actually have notches that help you match getting that sleeve in, because otherwise it's kind of a bit of a guessing game. Now, depending on the pattern company, there are multiple ways that you can mark notches. We use a little line or like basically a thick rectangle, but you might also see them represented as a triangle. The most important thing to note with those notches is that when you're cutting your pattern piece out, you really want to mark that notch. I tend to recommend just doing a really short snip into your fabric, about 1/4 of an inch. Alternatively, you can draw it with a piece of chalk, whatever is easier for you to help identify where that kind of match point is on your fabric. Another thing that you might see on a pattern and find very confusing are random, or what appear to be random, circles and squares kind of floating off into space. So if a notch is helping you understand where pattern pieces are matching on the kind of cut edge of the fabric, what circles and squares, depending on the pattern company, sometimes they use triangles, might be indicating on the interior of the pattern piece is a kind of critical construction note. So they might be marking the location of a pocket, you know, like a breast pocket on a shirt. They might be indicating where a particular line of stitching needs to start and stop. So it's just really important that you also mark those construction marks if you're happening to see them on the pattern. My favorite way to do this is when I'm cutting out the pattern, just stick a pin through the center of the circle or the rectangle and mark the wrong side of the fabric with a removable marking tool or colored pencil, a piece of chalk, something like that. Okay, so the next mystery thing that we're gonna identify on a sewing pattern is something called a grain line. Pattern companies are gonna represent this in a different way, various ways, but generally it's just gonna be a long line with an arrow pointing at the top and the bottom. What this helps you do is orient your pattern piece on the fabric itself. We're gonna have a full video about how to cut out fabric and how to make sure your fabric's on grain, but it's really, really important that you respect the grain line. The nature of fabric is that it's kind of woven vertically and horizontally, and that grain line needs to run parallel to the vertical grain line of the fabric. Because if you go and take a pattern piece and kind of randomly situate it on the fabric and aren't paying attention to that grain line, when you go to sew it up and wear it, it's gonna look wild. So grain line is very, very important, but I know it's a little bit confusing when you see it on a pattern. You don't need to mark a grain line when you're cutting out your pattern pieces, but you are gonna use it as a reference point to locate those pattern pieces on your fabric. And one little thing to note about grain line is that sometimes pattern pieces are cut on the fold. And this just means that you will be folding your fabric in half and you're going to be cutting all of your pattern pieces doubled. You're going to be cutting them 2 times. But some pattern pieces are cut on the fold, which just means that you're going to butt them up right against the folded edge of the fabric. And that means when you cut it out and open it up, it will be mirrored equally on either side. So grain lines can either just be kind of floating in the middle of a pattern piece, running up and down, or sometimes you'll kind of see them reflected with like turning a corner, and it should say on it that it's cut on fold. Okay, other vertical lines. you might see something called a lengthen and shorten line, and that generally runs horizontally across a pattern piece. And generally you're gonna see that in areas like a waist area or maybe in a leg area. And that's just there to tell you if you need it to be longer there because you have long legs or a long torso or a short torso or short legs, that is the best place to cut across the sewing pattern and then overlap or spread those pattern pieces apart to add the length that you need. You can kind of ignore them if you don't feel like you need them. Another mystery mark are body reference points. And you'll sometimes see those at the bust area, at the waist area, and at the hip area. And this is something I'd like to see more pattern companies marking. But basically, they're just there to help you understand this is where the full bust would be sitting in this pattern, this is where the waist is, and this is where the hip is. We try to mark these wherever we can on patterns. And I don't think if you're just getting started, you need to worry about them too much. But as you start sewing and maybe get more into fitting, those reference points can be really helpful for you to help identify if you need to make any fit adjustments. But for now, you can ignore them, but that's why they're there. Next up, let's talk darts. And no, I'm not talking about cigarettes or things that you throw at pointy bullseyes. Darts are really, really cool. They let you take a two-dimensional or flat piece of fabric and actually mold it into a three-dimensional shape. And they basically just manipulate the fabric and create curves where there weren't any. They are super, super cool, and they are very important that you mark when you're cutting out your fabric. So these little triangular areas are called darts, and you're gonna be sewing from the wide end all the way down to the point. You're gonna be folding your fabric together to do that, and this is what creates volume and structure inside sewing patterns. They are quite simple to sew. We also have a video for that, and they're kind of indispensable when it comes to sewing. Similar to darts, you might also see markings on a pattern piece for pleats. This are, again, they're just kind of telling you where the fabric needs to be folded together and stitched so that you can create pleats. And lastly, you might see marks on pattern pieces for things like button and buttonhole locations, or where a zipper needs to be inserted. Again, a well-drafted pattern will make these really evident to you. They're really just there to make your life a little bit easier. So if it feels like something you should mark when you're cutting out your fabric, mark it. Okay, let's talk about instructions. So once again, a well-drafted, well-designed sewing pattern, especially for garments, will likely include written instructions of some kind. And I really recommend you read them. I know not everybody likes to read a manual, but clothing is definitely one of those things that you don't want to just kind of leap into without kind of having a map to get to where you're going. So depending on the pattern company that you're working with, these look wildly different, but I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things you can expect to see in a sewing pattern instruction booklet. You should see definitely some kind of written description of the pattern talking about any of the features or details or little things that you need to know about what that garment actually includes. You'll also see something called a tech flat, and these are just simple line drawings that'll help you identify different details and style lines. Your instructions should tell you what kind of supplies you need and what kind of fabric you need. Really important to pay attention to this page because you want to make sure that you have the amount of buttons that you need or the type of interfacing that you need or any particular tools. And especially when you're getting started, make sure that you're paying close attention to those fabric requirements. They'll tell you what fabrics that pattern works the best in, and it's just gonna guarantee that you're getting off to a good start when you use a recommended fabric. Another thing that's always included in a sewing pattern is a size chart, and it's really, really important that you're taking accurate measurements and that you're paying attention to the size chart to pick the size that you need. Please note that sewing pattern companies do not necessarily reflect ready-to-wear sizing. So the size that you are in a sewing pattern may have no connection whatsoever to the size that you are when you're buying clothes at a store. The other thing to note is that each sewing pattern company has its own system for sizing, and so you might be different sizes in different brands. And so it's so, so important. I would almost say like the first thing that you do is you go and look at that size chart, you find your measurements, and you make sure that you're choosing a size based on what they're telling you and not what you think it is. You'll also see something called fabric requirements, and this is just gonna tell you based on your size how much yardage you need. Paying attention to this just means that when you go to buy your fabric, you're getting exactly what you need and not too much and not too little. And lastly, something that we love to include in a sewing pattern is something called finished garment measurements. And again, I wish this was something that all pattern companies included, but basically what this tells you is if you were to take that garment and put it flat on a table and measure it with a measuring tape, what the finished measurements are going to be. It can be really helpful as you start sewing, and again, like once you're a little bit more confident, if you think I might need a size down or I want to size up or maybe this is too loose for me or too baggy, those finished garment measurements can be really, really helpful. I would say as a beginner though, you can kind of just ignore them. At least for your first few projects, I find a lot of beginners tend to make a lot of assumptions about clothes looking at finished garment measurements. And if you don't have like a really good sense of how garments are supposed to fit and how much room you're supposed to have in them, like it's really easy to end up making an incorrect size. But again, as you get more advanced, those finished garment measurements are so helpful for helping you identify things like, do I need to lengthen this? Will I have enough room for my boobs, etc. Next up, a layout for a PDF pattern. And this is something we like to include in our patterns so you can kind of visually at a glance see how that print at home file comes together and see how many sheets you need and how many podcasts you're going to need to listen to put it together. Very important for beginners is something called a fabric cutting diagram. And like I was talking about earlier, you don't want to just take these pattern pieces you've cut out and put them willy-nilly on a piece of fabric. We work really hard and use very intense computer software to draft these cutting diagrams for you. And as a beginner, again, these are just going to help you place those pattern pieces and get the most yield out of your fabric. You just want to make sure that whenever we can, we're not wasting. And so following this just ensures that it's essentially the most efficient use of fabric and the easiest way to cut out your pattern pieces. When you're looking at those cutting layouts, you want to identify whether or not the fabric is laid flat on the table, which means that you would be cutting each pattern piece out one at a time, or whether or not the cutting layout shows the fabric folded, which means that you would be folding that fabric in half and cutting two out at the same time. And generally, just the quickest way to observe that is you'll see on the layout, you should see the word selvage and selvage or fold. And if you see the word fold, you know that this piece of fabric needs to be folded. And then of course, we get to the instructions themselves, which should walk you step by step through the construction of the garment. Depending on the company, these might range from very, very detailed to more sparse. We try to be as detailed as possible so that you're feeling really confident about each step of the way. And I would say the most important thing to pay attention to when you're sewing a garment for the first time and when you're looking at the instructions for the first time is to first identify what the seam allowance is. So that is the basically thickness of the seam that you're going to sew. And they generally come in either 5/8 or 16 millimeters or 3/8 and 1 centimeter. And just first thing is find in that pattern where the pattern maker is telling you what the seam allowance is. And the second thing that I recommend doing is there should be some kind of legend or guide for the illustrations, and you should pay attention to what side is the right side of the fabric and what side is the wrong side of the fabric. And this is especially true when the instructions have diagrams. So at Closet Core Patterns, whenever we are showing the right side of the fabric, it's white. When you're looking at the wrong side of the fabric, it's gray. And that is the type of thing that can get really confusing when you're assembling your garment if you're not kind of aware of what the right side and wrong side is. And the reason I'm telling you to pay attention to that is because it's not standard. Some people might show you the wrong side of the fabric as white and the right side as gray, which is inverted to what we do. So your instructions should include some kind of legend that will help you identify that while you're getting going. And next, you just actually have to use the sewing pattern to sew your first piece of clothing, which is going to be such a fun experience for you. I just want to let everybody know that it's totally normal at the beginning to be confused, to make mistakes, to even fail. Maybe the first thing that you make or the first few things that you make you don't even like. I think I always just like to remind people this is part of the process. This is how you get good at something is you practice, you fail, you get up, you try again. And if you're really struggling and you need a little bit of hand-holding or you're feeling overwhelmed, you want more one-on-one help, Closet Core Patterns has classes for you. Our Learn to Sew class has now taught thousands of people how to sew. It teaches you literally everything that you need to know from threading your sewing machine to cutting out your fabric. It includes 3 different patterns that we kind of sew from start to finish on camera. And I basically teach you everything that I know about sewing so that you can kind of tackle future projects with confidence. Sewing is what gets us up in the morning, and teaching people how to sew is my life's mission. So if you feel like you need a little bit of extra help, that's a wonderful resource. Hopefully sewing patterns aren't such a mystery to you anymore. If you have any questions, hit us in the comments.